Okay, so let's go ahead and continue here with the last part of chapter 10. Let's talk last point about the Electoral College, which we honestly did talk about this last time, but let's just kind of do this really quickly just as a review, as well as for the other students who weren't able to stop by. So we talked about how that there are some issues with the Electoral College, and the nature of the Electoral College does lend itself to some of these issues, right? So the first issue that's mentioned, of course, is the fact that the candidate that you could have a situation, and we've seen it, in the last couple of elections, in the last couple of years, we've seen the situation where the candidate that gets the popular vote, that wins the popular vote, doesn't necessarily win the presidency because they don't win the electoral college, right? So the president of the United States is the winner of the electoral college, but not necessarily the candidate with the most popular votes. Of course, we talked about how this happened in 2000 with Al Gore having more popular votes than George W. Bush. Again in 2016 with Hillary Clinton having more popular votes than Donald Trump. She had about 3 million more votes than him. This, of course, is in part because the Electoral College and most elections in the United States are governed by plurality, winner-take-all rules, as we've discussed throughout the last couple of chapters. The voting chapter, the political parties chapter, and this chapter, the campaigns and elections, we've talked about what the winner-take-all system and what a plurality election is, right? So with only two exceptions, which again, we talked about those two states are Nebraska and Maine, right? We mentioned that before, right? Each state, with those two exceptions, each state awards all of its electors to the candidate who receives the most votes in the state. So we talked about this, right? That second place doesn't get you anything in electoral college, right? You have to win the state. You have to get the most votes compared to the other candidate that you're running against, because whichever candidate gets the most votes in the state wins all of those electoral votes. And we talked about how that does also cause a situation where, like we talked about, like with California, right? If California is going to be overwhelmingly Democrat because there's a lot more Democrats in California than Republicans, then the candidate's going to get all the electoral votes, regardless of the fact that there were 1/3 of the voters in California that voted for the Republican candidate, right? And vice versa in different, like in red states, we have that as well, right? Red and blue states, states that are not competitive, that are not battleground states, you're going to have situations where, one candidate is going to win all the electoral votes and it's not even going to be close. So electoral votes are won on a state by state basis. This fact makes it mathematically possible for a candidate who receives the most popular votes nationwide to fail to carry enough states for their electoral votes to add up to a majority, right? And that's why, as we talked before about some of the pros and cons of the electoral college, there's some good videos that I have that discuss this further about the idea that the electoral college tries to make it to where you have to try to pick up as many states as possible, so you're not just campaigning in the urban areas like New York and LA, Chicago, Houston, and you actually have to go across the country to try to pick up as much votes as possible. But again, we also talked about the con to that is that instead of going to all the states, candidates are mostly just going to be going to the battleground states, right? Because logically that makes sense, right? If you have a limited amount of time, the Republican candidate's not going to go to California because California is obviously going to go for the Democrat. Same thing on the Democrat side. A Democrat candidate's not going to go to Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, because those states are not in play, right? They're obviously going to be Republican. And the other reason is that those states don't have too many electoral votes anyway, right? They're not going to go to Alaska because Alaska is Republican and it doesn't have it doesn't have very many electoral votes, right? I mentioned before how I think I said it earlier in the semester, right? That the Valley has more people than in Alaska. Like it's kind of interesting, right? That's how much the RGB has grown in these recent couple of years, right? We've got more people living here than in some of these own states. But yeah, but we definitely talked about this last time in terms of these are some of the issues with electoral college, and of course we had definitely a really good discussion on it. But I definitely want for y'all to understand how it works and why. And you'll see this, next year with the upcoming next presidential election. You'll see why is it that the coverage is focusing on certain states, right? Why do certain states get more attention than some of these other states? Sorry about that. Forgot to silence my phone. Apologize for that. But yeah, so obviously, of course, there's a reason why these candidates go to certain states as opposed to others. They're going to go to the states where there's more of an even number of Republicans, Democrats, as well as independents that could swing either Republican or Democrat. We talked about the independents before as well. So they're going to go to those states where there's kind of like an even balance between these different groups, and they're not going to go to states where it's not even, right? They also are going to want to go to states that have a high number of electoral votes, right? So you could have battleground states, but if they don't have too many electoral votes, then it might not necessarily be worth their while, so to speak, right? So, this is why they're going to go to states like Georgia, Arizona, that are battleground states, and they also carry a significant number of electoral votes because a good number of people live in those states, right? So, back about 20 years ago, the two major battleground states were Ohio and Florida. Those states are not really battleground states too much anymore. They're both of them have kind of gone Republican, um, and the reason for this is because some of these states, like as I showed you all the map in terms of the red areas, the blue areas, right? The red areas tend to be the more rural areas. The blue areas tend to be more urban areas. So so in those states that are kind of battleground, they kind of have a somewhat even number. That's why a lot of people have been talking about Texas as being the next battleground state, because the urban areas have gotten a lot more populated, as opposed to the rural areas. But there's still a lot of rural areas in Texas. So Texas for now is still kind of a red state, but it's definitely not as red as it was before, right? It's kind of becoming a little more pinkish, so to speak. So, but anyway, that's what I wanted to kind of wrap up here with the electoral college discussion. A couple of things that we'll talk about here are some direct democracy elections. So we talked a little bit about this in the first chapter when we discussed what direct democracy is. So let's kind of go through some of these examples here. So obviously, of course, direct democracy itself, just to kind of review what we went over before at the beginning of the class, it defines itself, right? It's the concept where people directly, they directly decide what course of action government is going to take, right? So we talked about how that like for the electoral college, that's an indirect, it's like an indirect election, right? Because you're not actually voting for the president, you're voting for the electors who will then select the president. And then for Congress, it's also an indirect democracy because we're not the ones going to Washington, we're not going to Capitol Hill and actually debating policy ourselves, right? We elect representatives who will then do those policy debates for us, right? But direct democracy is where we decide directly the decisions that government is going to take, right? So, so we have two examples, right? We've got ballot initiatives and referendums, right? The initiative and referendum, also known as ballot measures, are a form of direct democracy, and I think you all are familiar with these. What these are, these are basically where you get something on the ballot and you decide whether there's going to be a new law or a new policy, right? So this is something where the voters are the ones who ultimately are going to decide whether this policy fails or not fails. You see this at the state level as well as local levels. We're going to talk about the state levels first, and then we'll talk about some examples of the local level. So 24 states have what's called an initiative process. A ballot initiative is a proposed law or policy change that is placed on the ballot by citizens or interest groups for a popular vote. So the way this works is, this is where, and every state is different in terms of, some states have, well, what the states do is that they have, you have to get a certain number of signatures, right? You have to do a lot of paperwork. You have to turn in names of people that are in favor of this initiative. And once it gets enough signatures, then it actually gets put on the ballot for, the citizens of that state, to decide on that issue or not. This is how a lot of states, like especially like in the Western states, have gotten for marijuana to be legalized. A lot of them have gone through ballot initiative, because again, it's considered an initiative because it didn't start with the legislature. It started with the people, right? Now, of course, there are some hybrids of this. We're going to talk about how Texas does this as well, because Texas is kind of a little bit of a hybrid of this process. And then let's go to referendum. So all 50 states provide for legislative referendum. So a referendum is a law proposed by a legislature that is referred to the public for a vote of approval or rejection. So Texas does have this, right? Texas does have a referendum process when it comes to the legislature. So let me kind of explain how it works in Texas. So in Texas, we cannot start an amendment to the Constitution ourselves. Instead, it starts in the legislature. So the way it works in Texas is that if the Texas legislature wants for the Texas Constitution to be amended, then they propose it in the Texas legislature. It has to get a 2/3 approval in both the House and the Senate. The governor is not involved in this. Once they get that 2/3 approval, then it goes to the voters, and then the voters ultimately decide whether to amend the state constitution or not. The voters in Texas do not need a 2/3 vote. They just need a simple majority to amend the Constitution. And you'll learn more about this in Texas government, that most of these amendments that get proposed end up getting passed. We've had several of them the last couple of legislative sessions. I'm sure there'll be more coming up, after this legislative session ends in the next couple of weeks. So in the fall, there should be a state constitution election where the voters will then decide whether to amend the Constitution or not. And of course, as I've mentioned before, those state constitutional elections have really low voter turnout rate. Like, just unfortunately, it's just, and there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of people don't even know about the process, so they're not even sure what all this means. But yes, but I wanted to mention how in Texas, that's the example of the referendum election. Let's also talk about recalls as well. So here's another example, right? So ballot measures allow voters to make laws directly without intervention by political parties or government officials. So that's the whole point of ballot measures, right? That's why it's considered direct democracy, because it bypasses government officials and it allows for the voters to ultimately decide on these policies, right? That's why it's called direct. They also affect political participation, engagement, and behavior, and can help shape the national agenda, right? So these ballot measures can be very powerful because it can be a situation. I mean, like I said, we're seeing this with the whole debate about marijuana legalization, right? And how, because some states have already legalized it, and other states have also decriminalized it, that has influenced the national conversation about the war on drugs and what we as a society should do with some of these types of narcotics, and should we should social norms be more accepting of this type of behavior, especially with how widespread it is. It's in our culture and our media and our music. I mean, you look at all kinds of music, like rap music, as well as even rock music too. Like there's all this influence, right, when it comes to marijuana use and things like that. So popular culture has also had an impact on it, and so all of this kind of comes together in terms of shifting the national spotlight and the national attention on this issue to where now we're seeing more of an acceptance of it, right? So these ballot measures started by the people can have a lot of influence in terms of how these political issues will go moving forward. Now let's get to recall election really quickly. Now this is, of course, another example of direct democracy, right? So a recall election allows voters to remove state officials from office before their terms expire, right? Now Texas doesn't have recall elections. Again, this is some states do. The recall system originated in Oregon on the West Coast. This was during the time of progressivism in the the early the turn of the 20th century. So this is where we started to see more of this idea of having the public be more involved in the overseeing of these officials and things like that. So again, so just to reiterate, that a recall election does allow for if like the governor gets recalled, like let's say they haven't finished serving their term, they can recall the governor, and then the governor has to try to run for re-election in the recall election to try to keep their job. Let's talk about some two interesting examples, right? So recalls of governor include the removal of California Governor Gray Davis in 2003. For those of you who are familiar with this is how Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor. He was governor in California for several years. This is how he became governor back in 2003, because they recalled the current governor, and then there was a special election to elect the replacement governor. And this was happening at the same time, where you were voting to recall the governor, and then you were also able to vote for the replacement, right? The replacement candidate. So Arnold Schwarzenegger was able to beat. He defeated a gentleman by the name of Bustamante. He was the Democrat candidate, but yeah, so Arnold Schwarzenegger, was able to win. And of course, definitely not really a surprise, when it comes to the notoriety and the celebrity status. You could also make an argument that kind of put in motion, for other people like like Trump, to run for public office, with seeing some of these candidates with celebrity star power, able to assist with them being able to win public office. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger was not the first person to do that. Ronald Reagan was also a Hollywood actor who ultimately became governor. If any of you have seen Back to the Future, you'll know that the Doc Brown, when Marty shows up and he's like, Doc Brown asks, who's the president, in 1985, and then Marty says Ronald Reagan, and then Doc Brown's like Ronald Reagan, the actor. Like it's really funny. I love that movie, but it's pretty cool, right? So it's not new for these. Let me see. Is there somebody commented on my pop culture reference? Let's see. Jesse Ventura. Yes, Jesse Ventura too. Yes. Another great example. Another great example. Yes, of a let's see. Another great example of, obviously, of course, Jesse the Body Ventura being a former wrestler with WWF, and before he became WWE, right? So he won as a third party candidate, to become governor of Minnesota. Yes, very good example. Yes, Jesse Ventura is another great example. So yes, these there is something to be said about celebrities and people in pop culture, and how that can assist them with their political careers, right? So and there's other ones like Thompson, the senator from Tennessee, was also like in television. I think it was on Law and Order and things like that. He passed away a couple years ago, but yeah, there's been other examples of how people have started off in the entertainment industry and then move into politics. It's not that uncommon. And then in 2012, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker won a recall election and remained in office. So yeah, this was also this was an example where you had a sitting governor win their recall election. So Scott Walker was recalled, but he was able to to win his re-election. I can't believe that was in 2012. I vividly remember that election. I guess it just shows how old I'm getting. But yes, so these are examples of where in these states, and also remember that not every state has this provision, right? So Texas does not have this provision. But in states that do have these provisions, you can get for a for a sitting governor to be recalled. Okay, all right, let's get to campaigns now really quickly. So let's talk about campaigns. Let's see how much time we have. Okay, so let's see if we can kind of get through this as quickly as we can. Okay, so let's talk about campaigns here, and then of course we're also going to talk about fundraising and super PACs and all that stuff. So we're going to talk about money and politics. That's what we're going to be talking about here right now. If I have to go a little bit over, maybe just a couple of minutes, I do apologize, but let's see if we can try to knock this out by today, because it feels like we've been in chapter 10 forever. Okay, so a campaign, obviously, of course, is an effort by political candidates to win the backing of donors, activists, and voters, right? So I think you all know what a campaign is, right? Obviously, of course, a campaign is the method in which a political candidate tries to win an election, right? And it's all the work that goes into trying to win that election, right? I've compared campaigning to like practicing for a big game, and then the election is the actual game itself, right? Where you see if you win the game or not, right? So all the campaigning is the practicing and the training and the hard work that the athletes have to go through in order to ultimately, try to, come out on top and win their games. Whereas the campaign itself is, that's all the work that goes into the trying to win the election, right? So we'll talk about, the importance of, how campaigns try to get more support from these people when it comes to donors. People are going to donate money. The activists who are going to be working on the campaigns, volunteering on the campaigns, getting out into the community and trying to do the canvassing / block walking, going and talking to voters, door to door, calling voters through the phone banking, and then ultimately the voters themselves, right? Trying to get more voters than your opponent so that they can, vote for you and ultimately win this election, right? Now, of course, there are advantages of the incumbents, right? Those already in office. And we'll talk more about this in the congressional chapter, how that there's a reason why it's very difficult for an up and coming challenger to knock off a sitting member of Congress, because the incumbents have a lot of advantages, right? They already are well known. People know who they are. People know the work that they've done, because as an incumbent, what you do is you go to the people and you say, hey, I've done this, I've done that, I've sponsored this legislation, I've secured this amount of funding for the community so we can build, community centers, new parks, things like that. This is what I've done. My opponent can't say that because my opponent hasn't done this before, right? So the opponent, the challenger, can't say those things. All they can say is what they will do. It's kind of like in a job interview, right? So for those of you who have interviewed for jobs, one of the most important things that hiring managers and supervisors, what they look for when they're looking to hire candidates, is they're looking to see if the candidates have prior experience. And that's something, of course, that I do when it comes to, like, let's say, like when I'm applying for some of these adjunct positions. One of the things that sets me apart from other people is that I'm a full-time professor already. I know how to certify rosters. I know how to grade stuff on different learning management systems. I know what a learning management system is. I know how to conduct these lectures and grade discussions and essays and things like that. So if you've got someone else who, let's say, they just graduated grad school and they've never done this before, they're not going to know anything about this, right? It doesn't mean that they can't learn it eventually, but they don't have that expertise yet because they've never done it before, right? So that's why that usually sets me apart from other candidates, because I have a lot of experience, right? So same thing with the incumbents, right? They have that experience, they can point to that experience. Now, of course, it also depends on if it's good experience, right? Obviously, of course, just because someone has experience doesn't necessarily mean that they're good at that experience, right? So they also have to look at that as well. And of course, there's other things when it comes to, like, if, let's say, one political party is just very unpopular, kind of like what happened, with the Great Depression. So yeah, Herbert Hoover was not going to win re-election regardless of whoever was running on the Democrat side, because the country was just so mad at the Republicans for, because the Republicans were blamed for the stock market crash and the Great Depression, things like that, for better or worse. But for the most part, the incumbents usually do have a substantial advantage over the challengers, and they have little difficulty attracting supporters and donors because they already know a lot of these people. Because they already did that work the first time, right? When they won this election, right? They were able to get support the first time that they were elected, and they were able to get some important donors, and they've been able to do so while they're still serving in their elected positions, right? Because once you get in, you get to it's like a whole new world for fundraising and support opens up for you, right? Like, you get to meet all these different these different people, right? Because now you're, especially like in Congress, right? If you're new in Congress, then you get to coordinate with your fellow Congress people, and they they tell you about their donors and things like that, and so you network, and you're able to just get to know a whole bunch of people. So once you're in, the hardest part is getting in, right? Once you're in, then you can you can have a vast access to these donors and things like that, right? So that's why the incumbents are usually going to have a lot more money than the challengers, because the challengers don't really know anybody yet, so hopefully that makes sense in terms of why there is an incumbency advantage, for better or for worse. That's the whole reason for why we have it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the campaign organization. So campaign organizations, of course, are critical for success, right? And this is also something that I've seen because, again, I have volunteered on a variety of different campaigns, and I've seen how some campaigns are run. Obviously, of course, some campaigns are run better than others. But the campaign organization, in terms of how a campaign is comprised, who works in the campaign strategy, all of that is vital to trying to win an election. You have to run a good campaign in order to be able to try to win an election here, right? And this is not just at the national level, but at all levels, right? Now, of course, at the national level, the higher up you go, the more money you're going to need, the more staffers you're going to need. It's going to be a much larger organization, but you still need a well-run organization in order to try to win these elections, right? So national and statewide candidates retain professional campaign consultants who work to craft campaign messages, conduct public opinion polls, produce TV and social media ads, open field offices, and leverage data about constituents from voter files, texts, emails, and donations. So let's kind of break all this down here, right? So again, as someone who's volunteered on different campaigns, and my mother, she was working for for a campaign just a couple of months ago. She was actually she was actually started off as an organizer, and then she moved up to be a supervisor. So all of these campaigns, especially like your state and your national campaigns, because obviously these are going to be a lot larger because you got to reach a lot more people, especially like in a large state like Texas, where you got to reach a bunch, millions and millions of people. You're going to need different people to do to perform these different tasks and responsibilities. So yeah, so just to let you all know, yeah, you can go and work for campaigns, right? Now, one thing that I also need to mention in terms of my observations when it comes to working on campaigns, this is why I would never do it, because if you're going to be someone who is a professional campaign employee, campaigns are a temporary operation, right? They start once a candidate declares for for the office they're going to run for, and then the campaigns end once the election's over, right? So once the election's over, then that particular campaign is over. And so now you're going to have to look for another job, right? You're going to have to look for another campaign. And campaigning does not, there are seasons for it, right? So we're going to be coming up on campaign season. Like right now, it's not campaign season because we don't have a major state or national election coming up, right? But campaign season is going to pick up again in the next couple of months once the debates start, and once we have the official candidates running, and then once we have the primaries and the caucuses starting early next year. So then we'll be in campaign season again. But the point I'm trying to make is that people who work for these campaigns, they have to understand that, right? So they can make decent money. You can make decent money on these campaigns, but then you have to tie that money over until the next campaign that you can go work for, right? So that's why I personally wouldn't do that, because that's a very unstable way to make money. But for people who are starting off, like let's say like people like are trying to start getting good experience, or retirees. That's why my mother was able to work for this campaign recently, because she was retired, so she had her retirement income coming in, so she supplemented it. This job is perfect for those people. But that's why I personally wouldn't do this, because I would have to leave my SEC job to go do something like this, and I'm not going to do that, because not for something that's temporary, right? It's a temporary job, that's what I'm trying to say. But again, but a lot of but these campaigns do try to hire these people temporarily, right? When it comes to, like, let's break some of these down, right? So you have to have a campaign manager. All these campaigns are going to have campaign managers that actually oversee all of this. But below the campaign manager, then you have your actual specialized staffers, right? Like they craft campaign messages, right? These are the people, of course, who are going to be writing up the messaging for the campaign, right? And making it look nice and neat, and styling it in a way for people to be able to understand, right? Then you're going to have your pollsters, right? The people who are going to go out and conduct the polls in the community, right? And then analyze those polls, and then try to see what they can do to try to get those poll numbers up within different communities in different states. You have to have your TV and your social media managers, right? These are the people who are good with with TV production, right? You got to have your camera people, right? Your people who can they've got TV film experience, and they can create campaign ads and things like that, right? So they have to have that they have to have that movie experience happening, right? Not necessarily like Hollywood, so to speak, right? But they have to have that AV video production experience, right? And then of course also people that are social media, the tech savvy people, right? People who know all the different social media apps, not just Facebook, but even some of the more recent ones, like TikTok and all that. So, because campaigns also have to try to appeal to like the Gen Z voters, right? And try to get, those people that are into, some of these newer social media, these new social media platforms here. Open field offices is another thing, right? That the campaigns, what they do is they open these temporary offices, right? So depending on how large the campaign is, they'll set up these temporary offices, and they'll rent out these these unoccupied buildings, and sometimes it's not even really like a big building. It might just be like a room in a building. It might not be the whole building, but they might just have a room. And so you have to staff those offices to make sure, like, if people are stopping by, if they want to buy, campaign material like, buttons and, the signs and things like that, because that's another thing that campaigns also do, right? Is that they also run a campaign store, right, where you can buy bumper stickers, you can buy yard signs, you can buy, other, like I said, the buttons and the other, the hats and the shirts and the campaign, what is it, paraphernalia, in terms of, so you got to have somebody that runs the campaign shop, and then the field offices will usually have those items available, to either to give or to sell to people. Normally, these field offices have like a bunch of signs, and as we get closer to the election, they're trying to hand out the signs because they're trying to get as much support as possible, right? It's kind of like crunch time. It's like finals week, right? Before the election, and then leverage data about constituents from voter files, text, emails, and donations. So of course, this goes back to the micro targeting that we talked about before, accessing the voter files in terms of who voted and trying, and this is already going on. I'm already getting texts and emails from, different people within not just campaigns, but also like, I've said before, right? Like I'm getting emails from like, people on the Democrat side. Like I'm like, it's not them personally, right? It's a mailing list that they run, right? So I get emails, from like Hakeem Jeffries, the current, House minority leader on the Democrat side. It's not, again, like I said, it's not him personally, but it's a mailing list. So I get these emails from these, from these people on the Democrat side because they have my information, right? They know that I'm a former delegate. They know that I'm a that I'm a Democrat, right? So they have that information, and so they're contacting me, right? I'm also getting text messages because they have these large database files where they have, people who have donated to. So they also have my information because I've donated to Democrats, right? So they have my Act Blue information, right? That I've donated to these candidates, and so that's how they're able to comprise this voter database file of their supporters, and they try to reach out to their supporters to try to get them to to vote in these upcoming elections here. So, okay, let's kind of move through this really quickly. We definitely want to talk about the PACs and the funding really quickly before we end, because we definitely do have to talk about Citizens United and the money in politics, right? So candidates begin raising money early. The earlier, the better. This next one is true because I've actually heard this from my friends who have run campaigns. Many candidates spend more time soliciting donations and engaging in other campaign activities. Yes, this is very true. I have actually heard this, from, like I said, one of my good friends. She ran a congressional race last year in over in the Laredo area. She's a good friend of mine, and she was talking to me about how that, the thing that she did the most, and this was by far the most, was to call up people for donations for the campaign. And she told me that she didn't like doing that because she doesn't. It's not. You don't like. It's not a. She felt like it was. It felt. How do I say it? It's like she didn't want to ask people, for the money, right? Because I mean, who wants to ask people for money, right? I mean, it's kind of, money is something that's very important to us. It's what allows for us, to live our lives, So going and asking, I mean, if someone goes and asks you for money, right? It's kind of like it's kind of a not too good of a feeling, right? At least for a lot of people. So she was talking about that, right? She was talking about how that it was something that she didn't enjoy doing because it's, people's hard-earned money, right? But unfortunately, because of the way campaigns are set up in America, that they are, for the most part, run by private donation. So you do have to try to, call your donors and talk to them and see if you can. The worst thing is that, like, let's say you have to, and this did happen as well, where you have to talk to your donors, you have to try to get them to donate even more, right? Because, and of course, also keep in mind that the campaign, because all this that we talked about, right? The campaign store, the printing of the signs, the paying for the database access, the paying for the workers, right? All of that costs money, right? It's not free. So the campaign operating costs goes to running the organization, because a campaign is a temporary organization, right? It is like a temporary company, right? So think of all the think of all the things that have to be spent in an organization and a company, right? So the campaign is the same way. Some of these really large campaigns also provide health insurance for their employees, right? So So that's very expensive, right? Because healthcare is extremely expensive in this country, right? So a lot of that money also goes to healthcare coverage for the employees of the campaign, right? So think of it that way. Think of campaign as like a temporary organization, a temporary company. So think of all the costs that a company incurs. It also gets incurred for a campaign here. Serious fundraising efforts include trying to appeal to both large and small donors. Right, there's another big point, right? And we've seen how some candidates, that is also a strategy that they use, right? Especially like on the Democrat side, like on the like this was started by Bernie Sanders in 2016, where he was targeting small donors, right? He talked about $27 being like the average donation for his campaign, right? And so other Democrats like Beto O'Rourke and some of these other Democrats have also picked up on this, right? Where they cater to small donors, right? They don't want to just have a few people donating all of their campaign contributions. Instead, they want many more donors, but they're donating less money, right? So then it pools into a large amount of money, right? So that's kind of a strategy also that certain politicians and certain candidates will appeal to, right? Because they feel that that makes them appealing to the everyday person, right? That most of their donations are coming from everyday people, right? Instead of just having like 10 wealthy people donating, like 90% of their campaigns, right? So are those candidates, are they really going to the people and really trying to get the support of the people when it's only a small wealthy few that are donating to the campaigns, right? So you can see why that would be an attractive strategy that some of these candidates engage in, right? And again, that's that the campaigns make. Let me check the chat real quick to see what was said here. I'm sorry, I need to just get rid of that here. Let me go back to the chat here. They are mimicking because they don't want to appear. But yes, Ella, yes. Bernie did it because it was actually right. Right, because there is a lot of symbolism for that, right? Because, like you said, the candidates don't want to appear that they, like you said, that they're being bought by, special interests, which we'll talk about them on Wednesday. We'll talk about them a little bit here when we talk about the super PACs here. But yes, that is why it is becoming a more popular uh, tactic that's being used, especially on the Democrat side. But it does come with risks, obviously, right? Because if you're not, because you have to, obviously, of course, you have to work harder to get the, to equal the large amount of money that you need, right? Because you have to appeal to more people. But again, you could make the argument that that's the point, right? That as a candidate, that you should try to appeal to as many people as possible, right? You should try to get as many donations from as many people as possible, right? So, but yeah, no, I agree with you. I certainly, if I was running something, I would definitely go with that, because I definitely want more individual donations, even if they're smaller, because it shows that more people are supporting my campaign, right? So yes, I definitely feel that definitely, definitely says something about, who's supporting the campaign and who isn't, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about campaign ads, and then we'll get to some of this, and then let's see. And then we'll get to so yeah, we are probably gonna have to go a little bit over, but I'll try to finish up as quickly as we can here. Okay, so let's talk about strategies. Okay, so two important campaigns within the general election campaign. So we got grassroots campaigns, which are political campaigns that operate at the local level, often using face-to-face communication to generate interest and momentum by citizens, which we have talked about, some of these methods before, right? It's very people intensive, require volunteers to knock on doors, hand out leaflets, organize rallies, and it's very important for local and congressional candidates, right? So the grassroots campaigns, let me take another drink of water here. Okay, so we talked before about how grassroots campaigns are very important. And there's a lot of research out there. You all can look up this research yourself, and the research will definitely point to, and I read all this research in grad school as well, that grassroots campaigns work, that going and talking to voters, not just at rallies, but actually going to their houses actually works. Because think about it, right? If someone takes the time to go and talk to you personally, that says something about who this candidate is, who are the people associated with this candidate, that they actually took the time to talk to you, right? Let me check the chat really quickly here. That was Beto Rosso candidate. Exactly, right? Exactly, because that says something about who these candidates are, right? Because and you all have probably heard the criticisms that have been levied against candidates that, oh, they're just talking to us because it's election time, right? They just want our votes, right? So it's important if you're a candidate that's running for something, you have to go and talk to the people in the community that you're going to be serving, because why should we vote for you? Why should we support you if you're asking us, to give you this power? Then what's in it for us, right? Why should we vote for you? That's why, like I've said, I see all these campaign signs and it doesn't say anything about these candidates. It's just a face, right? Like I want to generally know more about these candidates, right? So that's why, if I was going to run a campaign, because I've talked about, I've thought about whether I'm going to do something or not. Whatever it is that I decide to do, if I decide to do something, my goal would definitely be that I need to knock on every door in whatever district that I am wanting to serve, right? Now, of course, that would be impossible, like if it's like a really big election, but that's why I would never run for something like big, like statewide. No, Texas is way too big. But if it's something local, then yes, the goal would be to knock on every door in the district, right? Because I need to do that. I need to go and talk to everybody in the district, right? Because that's my responsibility. If I'm wanting to put myself out there and wanting to serve the community, I need to do the work, right? I need to, and then not just during election season, right? I need to also go and talk to as many people as possible if I am elected, because the people I need to talk to them about what's going on, right? What am I doing? It's just like the office hours that I have, right? I'm expected to have office hours where you all can reach out to me and talk to me about issues. Same thing with the voters, right? But anyway, but the point is that the grassroots campaigns do work, right? Especially when it comes to the canvassing. They also call it block walking. There's different words for it, right? Where you go and knock on doors and you talk to potential voters to try to get them to vote for your candidates, as well as and of course also the organizers and the canvassers that go out and knock on the doors. They're also going to have the leaflets, right? The campaign literature, right? Where they hand out the flyers and the brochures of the candidates, right? As well as organizing these rallies where they get for people to show up, and then the candidate will talk about the issues that's concerning that they're concerned about, right? And again, and for local races, this is very, very important, as well as these congressional candidates, because they live in these districts, right? For statewide as well as national elections, obviously, and of course grassroots campaigns is important there as well. But because it's such a large area to cover, and it's so many people to reach, instead, instead we also go more with the mass media campaigns, right? Media driven and money intensive, because this is of course the television ads, and these television ads are extremely expensive, right? This is one of the highest costs that campaigns incur, right? Is to pay for TV spots, right? To run these 30-second campaign ads on TV as well as on YouTube. That costs a lot of money. So this is where a lot of the money usually goes to, right? Is for the television ads. Television ads very important for statewide, some congressional, and presidential candidates, right? So especially statewide and national elections, and I also saw it with congressional races as well as some of these state races as well. Like I was seeing tons of ads for the state senate race going over there in the Brownsville area to replace Eddie Lucio. It was Morgan Lamatia. She ended up winning. I saw a bunch of her ads all everywhere. Saw a bunch of ads from Monica de la Cruz, who ultimately won the District 15 here for Congress here in Hidalgo County and going up north, in that district. But yeah, and of course you all have seen tons of presidential ads as well as statewide ads, like we saw, with the recent governor's race, and we'll see more of these presidential ads coming up in the presidential election. Now, also do keep in mind that going back to what we talked about with the electoral college, right, is that the presidential ads are probably going to be run in those battleground states. So they're not going to run presidential ads like in Alaska, because first off, it's not a battleground state and nobody really lives out there, right? So even if it was a battleground state, you couldn't get too many electoral votes from Alaska anyway. So most of the money is going to be spent on these particular states, right? The battleground states in the presidential election. The campaign ads are also going to be run when a primary is coming up, right? So next year, you're going to start to see primary ads probably in early to mid-February, because the Texas primary is in the first week in March, right? So after March, you're not going to see any more of those primary ads because the primary is already over. So you also have to look at when the election day is. That can also determine when you'll see these ads here. Media exposure is critical for campaigns to reach and mobilize voters because obviously, of course, tons of people are on these media platforms, whether it's watching TV or on the internet. So you have to try to reach those people where they're watching, right? Most presidential and many congressional candidates spend money on paid media in the form of 15, 30, and 60-second TV and radio ads. Radio ads are also important too. You don't really hear too much attention to radio ads, but again, as someone who has thought about doing this, I've definitely been very interested in running radio ads. If, let's say I want to run for something, and the reason for this is because a lot of working class people listen to the radio, right? Like you've got your mechanics, your people who are working outside, they're listening to the radio, while they're working, right? As well as also people in the offices, right? They also listen to the radio, so I think radio ads is something that is a little bit underrated. It doesn't get as much attention as the television ads, but radio ads are also really important because of the fact that a lot of people listen to the radio, during working time. Now, of course, the radio ads have also kind of we also of course have to understand that some people have moved on to other music listening platforms like Spotify as well as the Sirius XM radio. So there might not be as many people listening to the free radio, but there's still a decent amount, especially maybe your lower income people that might not be able to afford some of these paid subscription streaming music streaming services. So you can still reach a decent amount of people, and it's still worth your while because radio ads are not as expensive as television ads. Television ads are a lot more expensive than radio ads, which makes sense, right? Because you're just listening to something, right? You're not actually putting something on a screen, so it's a lot cheaper to do. So I would definitely recommend that candidates need to use radio ads more than they do. I know if I was a candidate, I would certainly use them a lot more. And so what these ads, of course, do, they establish the candidate's name recognition and favorability, communicate candidates' stances on issues, and link the candidate to desirable groups in the community. That's why, and I'm sure you all have seen these ads, they make them real, how do I say it? There's always something where they're out at a parade talking to people, they do it to where it looks like they're out in the community, right? Or they're with their family. So that way it gives the appearance that these are good people. It's a great family. They're out, having a barbecue or things like that. It tries to look at a snapshot of the best days that the family has, right? To show that the candidate's a good person, right? Because they're a good family person, right? So you probably have seen some of those ads before, right? They try to cater to that, right? Try to create an ideal view of this person and try to paint them in the best light possible, right? So you have to look at that, right? Obviously, you have to look at, it's kind of like going on a first date, right? Everybody's nice on the first date, right? Because they're trying to make a good, first impression. So you kind of have to look at that as well in terms of the way these ads are run, right? And then in the later stages of campaign, ads can go negative. Negative ads are more likely to address policy differences between candidates. Yeah, you definitely see a bunch of negative ads, as we get closer to the elections or the general election or the primary election, where the candidates will I've always found it funny, they always put their opponent in black and white, right? For some reason, black and white is bad or something like that. It's, and I've never understood kind of that. I guess maybe, I like black and white movies. I like the Three Stooges, that's, so I don't know, but it's interesting, right? The candidates, they always put them in black and white, right? That's not good. Yes, the candidate with color, they're the ones who are the vibrant ones, I guess you could say. I guess it's kind of it's a psychological thing, so to speak, right? And of course, I also have a lot of very famous ads that I have in the additional resources. Some of the most famous presidential ads are the "We Like Ike" one from the 1950s. There was also the Daisy ad in the 1960s that Lyndon Johnson ran. There's also been some other famous ads, in more recent years, like the Willie Horton revolving prisons ad during the 1988 presidential election with George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis. So there's been a lot of these famous ads that I have on the additional resources. So these ads can be rather creative here. So in addition to buying ads, candidates can also try to generate free media coverage. free media coverage is obtained when the media covering candidate statements and activity does news, right? So, Trump was like a master of this, right? Like every time, like during the 2016 primary, like all the networks were like covering Trump, like every time he would like talk after like and not just after the results of a primary, but just Trump was just having a press conference, right? I remember there was this one where he was talking about like Trump steaks, and I was like, wow, this feels like an infomercial. Like, really, like this is what we're covering. We've got Bernie over here. He just won a steak, but everyone's talking about Trump and his Trump steaks. You know what I mean? So it's definitely kind of like hit or miss in terms of what the media is going to focus on, what they cover. But I know Trump got a bunch of attention during the 2016 primaries, and I don't know if it was because it was a novelty, right? That because I know a lot of people originally dismissed Trump. They didn't think that Trump could actually be the nominee. I did take him seriously. Like I was like, no, like you got to take this guy seriously. I would tell my friends, look, he's a people know him. He's when people think of like rich people, they think of Trump. He's usually at the top of the list in terms of who people think of. So I was like, no, you got it. This has happened before, right? We've seen celebrities win public office. So take this guy seriously. And I don't like I'm not the type that likes to say I told you so, but yeah, I definitely did not dismiss him, because I knew that he had a lot of the characteristics that would attract voters and things like that. Let me go to the chat really quickly. So I took him seriously. He was well, I mean, right, yeah, seriously, like in different ways, right? But yeah, in terms of a candidate, I did not dismiss him because I definitely I definitely felt that he could definitely get attention here. Okay, let's kind of finish up really quick because I know we have just a little bit more time to go. Debates obviously, of course, provide an opportunity to see candidates outside the campaign bubble. So so obviously, of course, you're gonna see a bunch of these debates coming up as we get to the primary season. So you'll see debates with uh, probably on the Republican side because I don't think there's going to be major Democrat challengers for Joe Biden because I think Joe Biden's going to run for reelection. So as we mentioned before, when you have a sitting president and they want to run for reelection, the tradition and the courtesy is to not have primary challengers challenge a sitting president, right? So on the Republican side, we're definitely going to see debates, right? Because we will see multiple candidates who will be running for president on the Republican side, right? So again, so the candidates make or break their campaigns on the strength of their performance during a debate. Gaffes, facial expressions, and unconscious gestures may sway public opinion. And of course, again, if you have not seen the South Carolina Republican primary debate with Trump, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, you need to go see that because it's interesting for all the wrong reasons. I guess you could say it was definitely entertaining. I definitely found it entertaining, but they weren't really talking about policy. But again, but some people like that because some people I look at a debate as kind of like a fight with words. Like people like they look at it as kind of like a boxing match, not a physical fight, but a verbal fight, right? A fight with words, a fight of ideas, So that's why a lot of they treat this debate like a sporting event because it kind of is like a sporting event, but not physically, but more mentally. It's kind of like a mental sporting event. And that's why there's a lot of attention that goes to these debates. And like it says, right, that's why they have to look their best. They zoom in on, like, let's say one candidate says something about the other candidate, so they zoom into the other candidate, see how he reacts to it or how she reacts. So it's definitely interesting, right, to say the least. And that's why they're pretty popular. Debates usually consist of civilized disagreement, although in some cases it can also engage into, I would say, uncivilized disagreement, right? The Republican primary debates of 2016 were uncharacteristically harsh. Again, the South Carolina one is the one that I'm talking about, right? Definitely go watch that one, as was the first debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Also, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton was also, that was also pretty intense, right? Remember that line where he said that she ought to be in jail, right? And, of course, now Trump is in legal trouble. So I don't know. It's just kind of interesting, right? So you can see how these debates can get pretty. If you want to compare debates, look at the 1960 presidential debate between John F. Kennedy, the senator from Massachusetts at the time, and then Vice President at the time, Richard Nixon, because he was the Vice President under Eisenhower. So look at that debate and see how they're really respectful to each other, right? And it's just a disagreement on policy, which is the way these debates are supposed to be. It's supposed to be just a disagreement on policy instead of having, going after each other personally, so to speak. But anyway, yeah, definitely take a look at those debates. And again, here's the comparison, right? So we got, very different in terms of, styles of debates, from yesteryear and to today here, right? Okay, so we've talked a little about micro-targeting. Different voters care about different issues. The idea behind micro-targeting is to send different campaign ads and messages to specific demographic groups of voters. So that's why there's a lot of research that's done to try to, to target specific voters and try to appeal to those different types of voters in terms of what issues they care about, and to also try to craft that campaign messaging to try to attract certain types of voters, right? So micro-targeting began with George W. Bush, the George W. Bush campaigns in 2000, 2004. It grew more sophisticated with the Obama campaign. The campaign used survey work with statistical algorithms, which you kind of talked about before in terms of some of the strategies and the tactics that are used in order to, to get at, in order to, some of those strategies in order to try to gain more of those voters here. Okay. Let's see. So let's talk. Okay, so let's finish up with Citizens United here really quickly, and then we'll finish up for today. So let's see how much time do we have. We've got about, it's 2:30. Do you all mind staying just a little bit longer, or do you all need to go? What do y'all think? Do you all need to go, or let's see. Let me stop the share really quickly. Do y'all want to stay a little bit longer, or do y'all need to go already? Can you all give me maybe about like 15 minutes? Okay, let's finish this up, because I want to finish the chapter by today, because I definitely want to, because again, chapter 11 interest groups, we're gonna have to kind of go through that one really quick, because we're already running out of time this semester. Okay, that's fine. So let's go ahead and continue, because I do want to talk. We do need to talk about the money in politics. We do need to talk about that. Okay, let's talk about polling really quick, and then we'll get to the money in politics. Okay, so almost all campaigns for national and statewide offices make extensive use of random sample public opinion polling of likely voters. We talked about this in chapter 6 when we were talking about public opinion. So of course, these are your national polls, like your Gallup, your Pew Research polls. These are polls that are nationally run and nationally accredited. And of course, we talked a little bit about how that these polls have to be, scientifically sound, right? Where they have the sample size, and then they have to look at, you want to get a larger sample size because you want to eliminate the sampling errors and things like that. So we talked about some of those statistics here earlier on before, right? But polling, of course, is where they get a group of people and they try to make that group, somewhat representative of the population. You don't want to have like a bunch of like elderly people in that poll, of course, unless you're doing a poll specifically for certain groups. But if you want and they do those polls also, right? They also will have more specialized polls for different groups, like different age groups, gender polls and things like that. But if you want like a general poll, then you want to try to make it as random as possible, but you also don't want to make it to where it's just a small subset of people, right? You want to try to have, more of a balance of different type of people, right, across age and ethnicity and also socioeconomic status as well, right? So these polls provide the campaign with information about which issues are the most important, trying to get a snapshot of, what the public is most interested in order to assist the campaign with their messaging. And they also identify the candidate's strengths and weaknesses and measure voter responses to the campaign, right? So we've also mentioned before how candidates who are wanting to run will do these exploratory polls to see, theoretically how much support is out there. Like a lot of the candidates, if they want to run for president, they'll do these exploratory polls, try to get a sense for, hey, is a run for president, is it feasible? Is there enough people that are supporting me as a candidate to where, yes, I'll go ahead and make that plunge and actually make that decision, because that is a very important decision. You're going to devote, pretty much your entire life to running for this position. So you need to know beforehand so that you don't waste your time, right? So you need to know beforehand if it's feasible, not necessarily whether you would win, but I mean, of course, you're going to try to win, but it would be hard to predict whether you could win outright. Of course, you have to go through the primary process, but is there enough support to make it to where you could have a good shot at it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then, and of course, also looking at, again, like the strengths and weaknesses, to try to look at what needs work, right? Okay, so, we need to talk more about this. We need, for the candidate to be more visible in certain parts of the country. We need to work on like how the candidate looks and present themselves, right? Because I know, like with Joe Biden, right, a lot of criticism is that people think he doesn't know what he's talking about, right? Because he stutters and things like that. Sometimes it's hard for him to think of what he's saying, which again, I mean, he's at that age where that happens, but for people, they look at that as a negative, right? So the campaigns have to try to work on those negatives and try to minimize those negatives, right? So once polls have identified supporters, campaigns reach out for fundraising and voter mobilization, like we talked about before, in terms of the reaching out, of course, and there's a variety of different ways, right? So we talked about the phone calls, uh, as well as the text messages, right? So once these polls have a group of supporters that they can try to reach out, they do so, right? So personal contact is the most effective at mobilizing voters. Direct mails and robocalls are the least effective, right? So what it's talking about here is that the best way to contact voters, like if you're not going to go door to door, the next best way is to actually call them, but have an actual person call them, right? That's where the phone banking comes from, right? And the way phone banking works is that you tap into a system. So you'll do it like from a laptop, because you tap into the system, and then it has a database of the supporters, right? Because again, the campaigns, what they do is they try to come up with a list of who they think are supporters for this candidate. And it doesn't always work that way, because I've had situations where I've called people and they're Republicans, right? And they're like, no, we're not going to vote for the Democrat or whatever. We're Republicans. So sometimes most of the time it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes people change, right? Sometimes people they change their political viewpoints. How are we going to know that they've changed unless we call them? But the point is that the most effective way is to actually call these people and to where it's actually an actual real person on the other line. The least effective is to have what are called the robocalls, right? Where you probably have received these spam calls before, right? Where it's just a recording, right? It's not an actual person, it's just a recording. That's why I don't really answer phone numbers I don't recognize, right? Because those are annoying, right? So, the cold calling with robocalls. So not only do you bother me, but you don't even have the decency to have a human being talk to me. No, screw that. And then direct mail, again, because people are just going to look at it as junk mail, and they're probably just going to throw it away, especially if they're not really all that engaged politically. So the best way is to actually talk to people, through the personal contacts, right, and things like that, and as well as actually meeting people in person as well. When it comes to the block walking and the campaign events. Okay, let's get to money in politics, because we definitely got to talk about this before we wrap up this chapter. Okay, so we're going to talk about Citizens United, and we're going to talk about super PACs and all that stuff. Okay, so many nations finance elections through public money, but not the United States. We talked about how the United States primarily uses privately funded money for these campaigns, right? And court rulings have allowed for unlimited spending. Now let's talk about this first. Let's go to the individual donor limits, and then we'll come back to some of these cases, because I do want to talk about this a little bit, and then we'll move on to the super PACs real quick. Yeah, so we'll talk about this first, and then we'll come back to the Citizens United case, right? So we should talk about the individual donors first. Okay, so individual donors are solicited through direct mail, phone, the internet, and face-to-face contact, right? So I mentioned that's why I'm getting all these emails from these mailing lists from these Democrat leaders, right? Because they're wanting for me to donate, and not just to them, but to the party itself, right? So you can donate to candidates, but you can also donate to the party itself. You can donate to committees, within the party and things like that. So there's lots of money that needs to be raised for these elections, right? Because it's not just for one candidate; it's also for the political party that's responsible for all these multiple elections happening across the country at the federal and state levels here, right? So one of the major responsibilities the political party has, like we talked about in the last chapter, is they have to try to fundraise, right? So that's why we get all these phone calls and these text messages and these emails, right? It's kind of like fishing, right? They're casting out their nets to see if they can, catch any donors, right? Now there are, when it comes to individual contributions, so this is me as an individual, right? There are limits to how much I can donate as an individual, right? So 2,800 per election, per candidate per election, 5,000 per federal PAC per calendar year, 35,500 per national party committee per calendar year, and 10,000 to state and local committees per calendar year. So these are the limits that I myself as a person can make, individual contributions. Okay, so there are limits to individual contributions, because The United States has tried to engage in what's called campaign finance reform, where they want to try to put some regulations on the amount of money that's donated by individuals, as well as regulations for transparency, where candidates have to disclose where the money's coming from and things like that. That's called campaign finance reform, those types of laws. Let's talk about political action committees. Now, this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky in terms of in terms of the amount of money. And this is where we start to see the larger amounts of money. So, political action committees, called PACs, are private groups that raise and distribute funds for use in election campaigns. They are established by corporations, labor unions, interest groups, or other advocacy groups. Now, let me not mince words here, that PACs and super PACs do tend to be rather controversial. And we're going to talk about why they're controversial here in a bit before we leave it. The reason why they're considered controversial is because you have a situation now today, and we're going to talk about this with the Citizens United case, where you have these groups that are raising large amounts of money, and they are using them in these elections. Now, the argument for this as to why this is allowed is because this is a First Amendment protection, because we're going to take a look at how some of these cases do allow for money and donations to candidates and campaigns that's considered free speech, right? If I donate to a certain candidate, that is considered free speech because I am expressing that I support this candidate with my checkbook. It also is allowed under peacefully assembling, this idea of gathering together. And we're going to talk about this in the next chapter, right? So that allows for people, of these organizations, right? If they work for a company or a labor union, it allows for them to form this group because they're trying to band together to influence government, right? Because they have that right under the First Amendment. Now, again, there's controversy about how much they should be allowed to do this, but that's a whole other story. But I want to explain why this happens. And we'll talk more about this in the next on Wednesday when we work on chapter 11. So the purpose of PACs is to channel contributions from their members to political campaigns. Allied or related PACs can coordinate contributions with one another, so some of these PACs can work together. But again, this is the whole purpose, right? To allow for the members of these groups to pull their resources together and contribute to these political campaigns. Soft money or unregulated contributions to national parties. This is intended for party building or voter mobilization and registration efforts rather than for particular campaign, right? So this is where these PACs are donating to the parties themselves, right? Not necessarily to a specific candidate or a specific campaign, but for the parties so that they can use that money to, again, for party building. This would be where the parties can fund the state parties, right? And they can try to move money around to assist with certain certain states and certain locations that might need help with mobilizing voters, right? If, let's say, the Democrat Party wants to move, try to get more support in another area, or the Republican Party wants to, which we're seeing right here in South Texas, right, where Republicans have invested money in a lot of these national and state and local races here in South Texas. Like I said, I'm doing a research paper on this where, counties like Starr County are seeing Republican challengers for countywide seats, and we haven't seen that in many, many years. In fact, the article I looked at, the county judge out there, Eloy Vera, he talked about how that he doesn't remember the last time there was a Republican that ran at the county level, right? So this is an example of the soft money where the Republican Party is using that money to invest in certain areas because they feel that they can try to win elections in these untapped areas, right? So that's an example of party building and voter mobilization in areas that the party would like to invest more. So the PACs can get involved in that as well. Let's get to super PACs. Now, super PACs and 501c4 committees are not covered by spending restrictions, right? So the PACs are, but the super PACs are not. So this, again, is also why it gets controversial, because they are not, the spending restrictions that we looked at a little while ago, the PACs are limited, but the super PACs and 501c4s are not, right? So they can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money. So that's why super PACs are more, you could say that they're more attractive than the regular PACs, right? So super PACs are 527 committees, and they have these names because of the tax status that they file when they register here. They're nonprofit, super PACs or 527 committees are nonprofit independent political action committees established for political advocacy. They're required to report funding sources to the IRS, right? So that's why they have these number designations, right? Because they do have to report that in terms of who donates to these super PACs, right? So that has to be reported to the IRS. The 501c4s, though, they do not have to disclose it, right? So the 501c4s are nonprofit groups that engage in campaign advocacy, but cannot spend more than half of their revenue for political purposes, right? So they are limited in terms of how much they can spend, the money that's coming in. They can't spend more than half of it on politics, but in exchange, there are no disclosure requirements for donors to the 501c4s, right? So for the super PACs, right, they do have to report that, they do have to report who's donating to the IRS. The super PACs, they do have to report that information to the IRS in terms of who's donating to them. But for the 501c4s, they do not have to report this, right? So this is why it's called dark money. Because if you're donating to a 501c4, that is kept secret. That information is not disclosed to the IRS. And that both super PACs and 501c4 groups cannot coordinate with candidate campaigns. So I know there's a lot to remember here, right? But just note that there's a lot of these different distinctions here. The super PACs and 501c4s cannot work together with a candidate. So they cannot be in cahoots with a candidate. They cannot be coordinating, right? But that doesn't mean that the super PACs and the 501c4s, they can get around this. Remember I talked about this before, right? I talked about this in one of the previous chapters, right? That if you've got like a Republican and a Democrat running for the presidency, right? So in the general election, you can see this a lot more clear. If you've got a super PAC that is running, and let me also explain the way these ads work, right? The super PACs, they run these ads. I've said this before, right? They run these like real patriotic ads, right? So if you've got an organization that calls itself like, Americans for Progress or Americans for Freedom, that's usually, if you see an organization with that patriotic sounding name, that's usually a super PAC, right? So the super PACs cannot actually coordinate with like, Trump or whoever is the Republican nominee or whatever, but they can run ads that are against the Democrat, against Democrats, right? So it's clear who they're supporting, right? If you've only got two choices, it's clear who they're supporting, even though they're not actually working together officially, right? It's not like, because the candidates, they can't have meetings with the super PACs, right? They can't be engaging with them. But if the super PAC is obviously supporting the Republican candidate, then it's going to be clear that who they're supporting, right? So they are helping out. It's not like the candidate can be like, no, you super PAC, don't run that ad, even though it's going to benefit me. Do not run that ad, because then the super PAC is going to be like, well, it's not for you to decide. The election, we can all get involved in the election. It's not for the candidate to decide who gets involved in the election and who doesn't. So that's why it's considered like dark money, and why there's some controversy with it, right? So okay, so let's see. Okay, let's talk about this real quick, and then we'll get back to the Citizens United. So presidential candidates are also eligible for the public funding. The Federal Election Campaign Act provides for public funding for presidential campaigns, but again, they don't really get too much here. Candidates become eligible by raising at least 5,000 individual contributions or 250 or less in 20 states, which pretty much any candidate can qualify for this. John McCain in 2008 was the last candidate to accept public funding. No presidential candidate is required to accept public funding, and those who reject public funds are not subjected to any spending limits. So this is why they do this, right? Because you might think like, why would the candidates not take the public money? Because the candidates make the calculated. They outweigh the costs and benefits, and they say, you know what? If we take the public money, we're going to be a lot more regulated. So we're just not going to take it. So that way we can we're not going to be subjected to like the spending limits in terms of what we, in terms of how much of this money we can spend and things like that. So that's why they do it, because the money that they would get is not that much. And so why would you just take a little bit of money and then incur more regulation from, the FEC, right? The Federal Election Committee. So they just figure, you know what, we're just not going to deal with that. That's why they don't really accept this money. And individuals may spend their own money as a constitutionally protected right of free speech, and individual spending is not subject to limitation. So this would be like, with Trump, right? Trump spent some of his own personal money. Michael Bloomberg is an even better example. He ran for president on the Democrat side in the primary, in 2020, and he spent a lot of his money. Tom Steyer was another candidate. He also spent a lot of his own money as well, right? And that's not subjected to limitation because it's his own personal money, right? So if you've got the money, you can decide to spend it like as an investment, I guess you could say, right? So, but really quickly, let's go ahead and finish up really quickly. Let's talk about Citizens United, and then we'll end here for today. Okay, so I talked about how that there are some controversial cases when it comes to the spending of money and where and why we have the unlimited spending when it comes to the super PACs. It comes from these specific cases, right? So in Buckley v. Vallejo, 1976, the court introduced the idea that money is speech. Remember what I was talking about right now, right? This idea that donating to a candidate is an expression of free speech, which is supposed to be protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution. So it allowed unlimited spending by candidates on their own campaigns, like we just talked about right now. If you've got your own personal money, you can spend it on your campaign, but left intact the provision of the law that limits individual campaign contributions. Okay, and so we still have those limits today, right? Where you still have those limits that I talked about right now in terms of, these are the individual contributions in terms of how much you can donate as a person individually. But we do have two more cases that allowed for these super PACs to really proliferate, because in Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission, the court ruled, and I've got some videos that talk about Citizens United. It's one of the most controversial cases in American history. The court ruled that independent spending by corporations is protected speech, right? Because the question was, does the First Amendment right about money as being speech in elections, does that First Amendment right that was adjudicated, realized in the Buckley v. Vallejo case, does that same precedent apply only to individuals, or does it also apply to corporations? And so Citizens United ruled that yes, that the provision of Buckley v. Vallejo, that money is speech, is not just for individuals, but it also is allowed for corporations. Because again, the idea is that, again, going back to what we talked about with the First Amendment, right? That it's not just individual speech, right? That you can engage in freedom of speech with other people, right? That's why you can engage in protests and peacefully assembling and petition grievances. So the idea was that those types of protections that apply to the individual should also be applied to corporations as well. Speech Now versus the FEC, which was like a companion case, allowed wealthy individuals and organizations to form these super PACs so that now they could engage in unlimited, contributions and spending in these campaigns. Now, before we end, why are courts constantly ruling that corporations can be categorized as individuals? That's a very good question. Well, it goes back to what I was, the Hobby Lobby case. You're right, exactly. Like we talked about before. It goes back to what I was saying, that the courts feel that the First Amendment rights don't just apply to individuals, but it also applies to corporations, because corporations are comprised of large numbers of individuals. Now, there's a lot of disagreement on that, right? There's tons of disagreement on that, right? Because some people might say, well, but who in the organization decides who they're going to support, right? Because you can have a situation where, let's say, a super PAC wants to support a certain candidate, but let's say not every person in the super PAC supports that candidate. What do you do then? Do you have to do a poll where you poll all the members of the super PAC, and then whoever wins that poll, that's who the super PAC supports? Or is it whoever contributes the most in the super PAC? Yes, that's why there's a lot of controversy with this case, because it does create a situation where, it's kind of unknown in terms of, the rules for how these super PACs are going to determine how they're going to support, who they're, what they're going to support in the election, right? Remember we said that they can't officially coordinate with them, but if you've only got two sides, it's clear who the super PACs are supporting. So, no, you bring up a very interesting point, and that's why this the Citizens United case. I think someone's here, but I think they're just talking about stuff. This is why the Citizens United case is very controversial. I think I mentioned to y'all before that my mentor professor at TAMU, he actually has a campaign. He actually has a sticker that says "Repeal Citizens United." It's something that's very controversial. A lot of people cannot stand Citizens United. But I do understand where they're coming from. I do understand the logic behind it. But again, it is controversial because a lot of people have different opinions about, wouldn't it have to be a unanimous thing and acting as one to be considered? Yes, that's a very good point. Exactly. Is who determines what direction the super PAC is going to go? Is it everyone? Is it the person with the most money? If there's any dissenting voices, they can't possibly categorize as one of it. Right. Well, it's definitely difficult, and it's something that I wish I had the answer for. But what I'm trying to explain is that that's where the courts see it in terms of that the right, the rights that we have under the Constitution in terms of free speech and how that also translates to getting involved in an election is not just for one person, right? You all get what I'm saying, right? It's not just for one person. It's for the group. But that's not where you all are disagreeing. Where you're disagreeing is how does the group determine which decision they go with, right? Exactly. If they're how do you categorize? How do they determine what is the one voice that the group is going to go with? You're exactly right. That is a very, very important question that I don't have the answer to, and that's why this is very controversial, right? Because what happens if, let's say, you've got a majority of people who don't, who want to go one direction, but the minority in this group have the money and they decide, so there's definitely a lot of questions. It raises more questions than answers, I would say, and I wish I had the answers to all this. But as I've said before, if I had the answers to this, I probably wouldn't be here. Right? I'd probably be in Washington. So, but no, but very good questions, very good points, and right, and that. But so, do you all see why this is very controversial? Right? Do you all see why Citizens United is a very controversial case, one of the most controversial cases probably of all time? Do y'all see why it's controversial? Like the things that you all bringing up, does that make sense in terms of why Citizens United is very controversial? So Ella says yes, I don't agree with. Yeah, there's a lot of strong opinions about Citizens United, and it does create a situation where, can the average person compete with a super PAC? Because the average person doesn't have the money that a super PAC has. But then at the same time, should groups be allowed to get involved in the election process? It's a tough one, right? So maybe people would like to see, like, I guess the question is how these groups get involved, right? And maybe trying to create more equity when it comes to, and that of course is why we have those restrictions on the campaign finance reform, right? The McCain-Feingold Act, which is what the Citizens United case struck down, was trying to fix that. Obviously, of course, named after the late Senator John McCain of Arizona and former Senator Russ Feingold of Wisconsin. They had worked together. Russ Feingold was a Democrat, and so it was a bipartisan legislation that was aimed at trying to work with campaign finance reform. So yeah, definitely a very interesting topic that I wish we had more time for, but it's already almost 3, and I don't want to keep you all much longer. But yeah, no. So what do y'all think about today? It was kind of interesting, right? It was an interesting discussion in terms of how money in politics kind of works. And we'll talk more about some of these interest groups next time when we discuss the interest groups chapter. So we'll have more to talk about on this topic here. Let's see. Is there anything else that I want for us to look at really quickly? Oh, let me see. One more thing, also, just really quickly. Definitely do look at party polarization. Yeah, let's talk about that really quickly. I think let's just kind of finish this off really quickly, and then we'll just give me just 5 more minutes, and let's just finish off party polarization, and then we'll finish here for today. So because I guess I've already kept you all long enough here. Let's talk about party polarization really quickly, and then we'll stop here for today. Okay. So was there another comment in the chat here really quickly? Let's see. Especially considering that Trump paid. That we could definitely talk a lot about that. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of discussion there. We'll see as that plays out. With what's going on in New York and things like that. So let's talk about polarization really quickly, and then we'll end it for today. So party polarization has also become a major issue when it comes to how the parties interact and how they work together or don't work together, I guess, is more likely. So polarization has increased over the past several decades. Basically, what party polarization is we talked about this a little bit before, but let's just kind of mention it in detail since it's here. That way we can kind of end our discussion here. Is that there's not as much bipartisanship nowadays because the political parties are moving further away from the middle. What this means is that the Democrat Party is moving more to the left and the Republican Party is moving more to the right. They're moving away from the middle and they're becoming much more ideologically different. They're becoming more diametrically opposed to each other, right? And the national news media has contributed to this increase, right? We've seen how even news organizations have also become polarized, right? We've talked a little about this before, right? How major news media outlets like Fox News is very Republican. They've always been Republican, but they've become even more Republican in more recent years. MSNBC has traditionally been more Democrat. CNN has kind of been in the middle, so to speak, but they tend to, I guess you could say they lean center left, so to speak. Um, and then, of course, there's also different newspapers also that tend to be, some of the liberal side, more on the conservative side. Like Vox, VOX. That tends, that's the newspaper run by Ezra Klein. That tends to be a little bit more on the liberal side. And then, of course, you have the Daily Wire, which is run by Ben Shapiro, who is on the conservative side, right? So even some of these news organizations, like another one would be like MoveOn.org, that tends to be on the Democrat side. That more on the liberal side. So again, so the news media also has become also more polarized, right? And as a professor, I see this because it's hard for me to find news articles and it's hard for me to find videos and news articles where the news people are not giving their opinion, right? Because that's another thing. Let me also mention this before, right? Is that originally about 20 years ago, like MSNBC, Fox News, they would have their opinion shows at night. Like they would have that was back when they had Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, and then with MSNBC you had Rachel Maddow and Lawrence O'Donnell, things like that. So you had those shows at night, and those were opinion-based news shows, right? Where they're talking about the news events, but they're also giving their opinion. Originally, those were left to being at night, but nowadays, now people are giving their opinion all the time, right? Now you turn on those news stations and everyone's giving their opinion. And sometimes it's hard to determine when it's opinion, excuse me, and when it's news, and then it goes back to opinion, and everyone's just giving their opinion. So as a professor, it's been hard for me to find, videos where people aren't giving their opinions. That's why for a lot of stuff I have, it's mostly like ABC News, CBS, NBC News, because that's where you just have the news broadcasters just giving, just reporting the news, and then they're talking about analysis. There's a difference between analysis and opinion. If you're giving an analysis about what's going on, that's different than giving opinion about what's going on, right? So, and that's very difficult for some people to understand, right? Because if you're giving an analysis, that's where the reporter is talking about what happened, why it happened, that's analysis. But if you're talking about, well, should it have happened, that's opinion. And so now we're starting to see that there's a lot more opinion than it used to be. So that's what's talking about. The news media also contributes to polarization. More people are getting news from ideologically partisan sources, right? Because again, most people are not tuning into the ABC World News at 5:30 anymore, right? Because again, most people don't really watch the local news or the national news anymore, because there's so much news now, right? We've got 24/7 news that you can get your news anytime you want. So because people don't have to tune in at a very specific time, it's not like the 1960s and 70s where you just had Walter Cronkite, where you just had ABC, CBS, and NBC, and that's the only time you got your news. Now you can get your news at any time, just kind of like with streaming services and how you can watch anything. That's why like TV viewership is also down in general, because you've got so many choices. So because you have so many choices today, that's why people can watch these partisan news sources. And plus the partisan news sources, you could also make an argument, is kind of a little bit more interesting, right? And more exciting, right? Because people like when some people like it, right? Like if you agree with the opinion, you like when the hosts get politically charged and give their opinions. I know my mother's like that. She watches Lawrence O'Donnell all the time because and the reason why is because she likes how opinionated he is, right? So again, if you agree with it, yeah, that's great. But what happens? But what does that do to the conversation? What does that do to where now everyone's just kind of dug in their own echo chamber, and they're not, the conservatives are watching Fox News, the liberals are watching MSNBC, and they're not really, they're just kind of staying in their own lane, so to speak, right? And so they just kind of hear what they want to hear, and it just builds and builds on this to where now that's why we have so much polarization. They look at each other side as, as, I don't know, like, there's like a lot of anger when it comes to looking at the different sides, right? So partly as a result, two major political parties have become more ideologically homogenous and less willing to compromise, right? Because again, like we talked about, the political parties are more dug in, right? Democratic Party is ideologically liberal. Republican Party ideologically conservative, and party activists have also become highly polarized, and this leads to demonization of opposition. Oh yes, you see this in the primary all the time, especially in the last couple of primaries. I mean, my goodness, in 2016, the fights between the Hillary supporters and the Bernie supporters. Oh my goodness, like that was insane to be seeing. Like in terms of the different the different the different political fights that I was seeing, and of course, obviously on the Republican side, you also saw that as well, right? I mean, it's become to the point where the supporters are dug in and right, and party activists usually are going to tend to be more polarized because the party activists are the ones who care more. The general voters don't vote in the primary. They don't really know too much about what's going on. They're just kind of more apathetic, right? They're not the type of people that watch Fox News or MSNBC or CNN for entertainment like I do, or like my mom, right? We're activists because politics is exciting for us. It's interesting. It's an interest of mine, right? I watch it just like I watch sports, right? It's something that I find interesting, right? But most people are not like that. So, but the party activists, because they're so interested, they're going to become highly polarized because they are more in tune, right? They keep up with what's going on, so they're more likely to be dug in on their side than the other side, so to speak. So, and again, leads to demonization of the opposition when we talked about when it comes to not just different political parties and different candidates on the different side, but also within the primaries as well. And the growth in presidential power has greatly increased the intensity of political battle. Specifically, as the role of the president becomes more important, so too have presidential contests, right? And of course, we've talked about how Trump has fueled polarization with, his rhetoric, like we talked about before, and we saw the impeachment process also led to further polarization. Of course, we saw how both sides of the Republican-controlled Senate declined to convict Trump, and tensions have remained high between Democrats and Republicans, as well as tensions over the nomination process of recent Supreme Court justices like Amy Coney Barrett, as well as Kavanaugh also was very contentious. That was another one. So, and things like that, shortly after Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. Also, of course, the Merrick Garland situation, where Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader at the time, held that seat and did not allow for Merrick Garland, who was President Obama's nominee, to replace who was it? It was it was Antonin Scalia, right? Antonin Scalia passed away, and so this was during the year of an election season, and so President Obama made the selection of Merrick Garland, who is now currently the Attorney General, to take Antonin Scalia's spot. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said that no, we're gonna wait until the election happens to see, the next president should make the selection. But then the same thing happened where Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away even closer to the election than Antonin Scalia did in 2016. She passed away in 2020. And the Republicans decided to go and nominate Amy Coney Barrett, but they didn't follow their own precedent. So we'll leave it at that because I've got some strong opinions about that, and I don't want for this to delve into that. So we'll just leave it at that. So anyway, so that pretty much sums up everything we need to cover for today. So does anyone have any questions or comments? If you are interested in that situation, you can definitely look it up, and it does go more into detail on what happened with the Supreme Court nominees the last couple of years. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the Supreme Court chapter as well. We'll talk about that. But does anyone have any? So I'm sorry that we pretty much went a whole hour extra. I am very sorry about that. I just wanted to get this chapter done because we need to get it done because we need to move on. We've got other things we have to talk about before the semester ends. So thank you all so much for sticking by. I really appreciate it. That says a lot about you all. Does anybody else have any other questions before we end for today? Nothing else? Nothing else? Okay, all right. Well, then I guess we can go to an end for today, and you all take care. Y'all take care, be safe, and we'll see you all next time, okay? Thank you all so much, and be safe, and we'll see you all next time, okay, everyone? So please, reach out to me if you all have any questions, okay? So y'all take care. Let me stop the recording, and you all be safe. Thank you. Thank you for your good discussion as well. Very good discussion, very good points. And I'm glad we discussed everything that we discussed here today. So we'll work on the interest group chapter next time. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Take care.